What's up, everyone? It's been about a year since the last time I did a Sekka Hinoki Cypress video on this channel. And in the last video, which you can look up in the back catalog, I cut back some tall Hinokis like this pretty hard in order to get them to essentially create small little balls of foliage instead of long spikes. So now here we are a year later, and I have a bunch of these. In fact, I have a reasonably large batch of them. I think there's about 50 of them that I cut back like that. So today I'm going to go through and see what the results look like, and I have to admit I did not keep track of the exact plants that I used in the previous video, but I did a large enough batch that I think this will be representative of the same technique. So I'm going to start by just clearing out a little bit of the interior foliage here, just like I would with like a Kishu or Itoigawa juniper. And the goal here is to be able to add a wire, because I think that the trunk on this one is not straight, and I'm going to, generally speaking, go for straight trunks on most of the compositions that I'm doing with the Sekka Hinoki. So I'm pulling off little bits of foliage that are like way into the interior, like just like little tufts that are coming straight off of the main leader. Now, so these guys here are nicely coming off that main leader a little bit higher than the rest of these branches. And because I know that Sekka can be relatively sensitive to wiring, I'm not going to wire out all of the branches. And in fact, a friend of mine turned me on to another channel here on YouTube that appears to be almost all videos about Sekka. Unfortunately, it's in Japanese, but I think you guys might enjoy it, so I'll put a link to the other channel in the description. Dumped out a little bit of soil, and as you might expect, there's more height here than what was apparent. So I'm going to start by sticking a piece of 10 gauge copper wire in here to see if I can just get the trunk straightened out. All right, now with the wire on, I'm just going to go ahead and bend this slightly. And I'm making the trunk a straight line despite the fact that it's actually not standing up straight. So I just stuck a chopstick in here and wrapped the top of that wire around it to try to get this thing to stand up a little bit straighter until the next time I repot it. Meanwhile, what I'm going to do is, they don't really seem to like to be wired. So rather than actually wiring the branches, I'm going to see if basically hooking pieces of copper through the holes in this basket and then up over the branches to just kind of pull them down slightly will be a good alternative. So I think the idea here is basically that we don't want all of this little growth that's down in here to get shaded out while we are growing out the primary branches. And so by kind of spreading them out like this, we're giving ourselves a better chance of keeping that interior growth looking good. All right, I have to say that looks just as silly as I expected it to look, but that is essentially what I wanted to do at this stage. So I'm going to set this back out to grow. Now, this hooking thing obviously is a lot easier if you have a pond basket where there are holes all the way around, but the next one, or actually the entire rest of the flat, are in gallon containers. So I'm going to have to find a different technique in order to make this a little bit easier on those. So I'm starting off by just thinning this out the same way that I did the other one, and the same way that I would essentially a Kishu or Itoigawa juniper. One of the differences, however, is that as I go in here and I watch as I pull off bits of foliage, in some cases I'm seeing chunks of bark come off. So I'm going to scissor off growth rather than pull it off with my fingers to avoid wounding the bark any more than absolutely necessary. So I'm concentrating on removing small bits of needles. I don't want to go through and completely denude the entire trunk or undersides of all the branches. I just want to remove enough growth here so that I can kind of see what's going on structurally, but leave myself lots of options. So it actually took me probably over an hour to do some clean out, and essentially what I'm trying to do is just a 20 to 30% reduction in foliage. So now that I've got that done, I want to take the trees and I'm going to kind of pull these branches down a little bit like I did with the other one. So I have to say this looks completely ridiculous, just like the other one, and in this case I've left these long tails of wire, which I will now kind of cut off here, basically looping the wire around a branch and then leaving a long tail so I can grab another branch above and move it as well. It's sort of like a daisy chained guy wire sort of system, and I'll just have to see how it works out, because it's something that I've seen other people on Japanese YouTube channels do, but it's also kind of a nice, interesting way of not having to wire something when you want the branches to be relatively straight, but you want to set the angle and the plant is potentially sensitive to actual normal wiring operations. As opposed to the last couple, I think with this one I'm going to aim for a smaller size. And size-wise, it seems like you want to let them run for a little while to build up a little bit of taper in the trunk, or a little bit of girth in the trunk, and then cut them back and get this bushiness. But if you're going to make a really small tree, I think that you need to cut back pretty hard. So I'm going to remove a fair amount of growth from this and try to sort of set it on its way to being more in the style of like a California native cypress, like Monterey Cypress. I don't see a good way to use just hooking the wire to the pot on this part to actually accomplish what I need to accomplish. So I'm going to go ahead and put some wire on here, and maybe it'll be an interesting comparison within the same plant using two different techniques, because if these two branches die, although the proximity to the gin could also have an influence, then that could be a good argument for not wiring. And because I want to keep this one quite short, like a mame size, I'm going to now cut back all this top growth to make it further divide. So aiming for about 3 inches. It's taller than 3 inches right now. All right, so just like the others, it looks like a giant hideous mess at the moment mid-process, but kind of interesting as well. All right, and now lastly is this taller one. So obviously I picked this and it was not part of the batch of ones that I cut back in the same short kind of manner. So it's an interesting thought process to think about, like basically this initial sort of strong vertical growth is giving you the height on your trunk, but then everything past the time where you cut it back is kind of more directed into those side branches. So I get to decide, well, how tall of a tree do I want? So given that the others were all either mame or shohin, I'm going to go for a slightly taller tree here, or a significantly taller tree. Now, I guess the thing to keep in mind is that as the tree gets bigger, the timeline for development is going to get longer because you need a bigger trunk and you have more branching to grow. But I'm going to, because this has a reasonably nice straight tall trunk and it's already starting to build some taper, I'm going to take the long branches off the top here and just sort of thin things out and cut things back gently. So one of the downsides of these hinokis in general is that the branches have a tendency to stack on top of each other. So I'm going to go through here and kind of thin out branches. I don't think that this trunk was wired to twist it like I've done with some other hinokis. In other words, twisting the trunk while it's still young and pliable to make it so the branches are not stacked on top of each other. So I kind of find it kind of interesting that these branches, for whatever reason, are kind of already at about the right angles, and they're kind of small, so I'm just going to leave them alone and set this aside to grow for a little while. All right, well, I did all 6, and it was kind of interesting, but 3 of them were very similar, so I'll spare you all of the details. But it was kind of interesting to do this process. I actually haven't done this exact process before with Sekka Hinoki, and I probably wouldn't have felt confident doing it if I hadn't found that YouTube channel from Japan. So check it out. That wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.